at age 70, 7 years ago, 6 years ago, in part because I got traumatized as the machines, the technology got smarter, and I got older.
Yes.
And I have never done, for my friends here in Crawfordsville, a slide show. And I don't actually know if this old man has it in. So, Stephanie and Amanda assure me that if anything goes wrong, they can take care of it. And if they can't, I'm going to go home. I brought some memorabilia stuff. There is a book that has, among other things, the script from Ben-Hur and other Toga plays and films. I have some of my memorabilia about the material culture of Ben-Hur, advertisements and what have you. And then I have the souvenir program, so that you can, it's a very good copy, and you can look through it, and you may do that as you like. And we'll see how this goes. Where's my clicker? All right. One of the things I like about coming to Crawfordsville is I'm not sure I may not be actually the oldest person in the room. So if I have senior moments, hold on.
You are among friends.
They're coming, yeah. Okay, here we go. We meet, and I read my lectures. I do it pretty good, but I read my lectures. That apologies. We meet tonight near the end of the first year of the study's 2-year focus on Ben-Hur and its impact on American culture. This first year has been given over to, as the title of the exhibit states, Ben-Hur as Lou Knew It, the novel and its first adaptations, the lectures, Magic Lantern Show, and a stage play. These first adaptations laid the framework for what becomes a tradition of adaptation, unlike that of any other American novel. It is unique. For me, the most important theme of that tradition has been the move from print to visual culture, as Ben-Hur overcame American opposition to first reading novels, then attending the theater, and finally going to the picture show, as we used to call it. In my lecture tonight, and in the ones I will give next year, I hope, I will focus on how the basic story changes through the almost century and a half of adaptation. In thinking about that tradition, we need to remember that a work of fiction has two basic components: its plot and its characters. Adaptation involves changes in both. If any of you saw the 2016 film last night, you know how much a thing can change. It is virtually unrecognizable. I began my research. You didn't expect that, did you? Didn't expect the pop. I began my research on Ben-Hur in the early years of the last decade, just about the time that Warner Brothers began to film the 7 Harry Potter novels. Several directors of those films, complained about how hard it was to film novels that had been virtually memorized by millions of kids. It's kind of like reading, you have grandchildren, 3 years old, reading your grandchildren a book when they memorized it at 3, and you have to go back and you can't change it at all, that kind of stuff. I wondered at the time if fans of Wallace's novel had that kind of constraining power over the first major adaptation of Ben-Hur, which was William Young's stage play of 1899 that toured for 20 years and was seen on 3 continents by perhaps as many as 20 million people. Let that sink in. But unlike the Harry Potter novels, Wallace's Tale of the Christ was not brought to the stage until almost 2 decades after its publication in 1880. And in those 2 decades, Americans became accustomed to hearing and seeing adaptations of the novel. Wallace himself gave lectures, especially on the spectacular action-packed chariot race. The redoubtable Virginia Sappho Mercer, I love this picture, put together an entire evening. I love the off-the-shoulder look. An entire evening for Ben-Hur that consisted of her reading the novel's chapters on the healing of the lepers. She made lots of money. Wallace and Harper Brothers authorized a tableau vivant production that featured readings from the novel, in this instance by Mrs. Lida Hood Talbot, while posed actors and carefully staged scenery depicting what was being read. only one adaptation, an unauthorized 1896 English magic lantern show, attempting to illustrate every one of the important events of the novel, and they are all right there in that wonderful cabinet. Wow. That was weird. Here is a view of how a magic lantern, you ever wondered what these things look like? Here is a picture of how these things actually looked and worked. The magic lantern, or stereoptically it was also called, version of Ben-Hur, was advertised nationally and made money, which is probably why Lou and his publisher sued and shut it down. No. But that didn't stop shows like Ben-Hur, delineated in story and song, in which J. Wilder Fairbank held forth on the Riley slides, and other artistic representations of the Holy Land, which were enhanced then by periodic musical selections by Miss Edith M. Nichols, including one of the songs from Ben-Hur, and also the Chariot Race March, and the ever popular of the Holy City. What the Holy City had to do with Ben-Hur, I do not know. Which brings us to William Young and his stage play. A lawyer as well as a rather well-known playwright, Young told Wallace's Tale of the Christ in 6 acts with 13 scenes, which concluded with a spectacular kind of hallelujah chorus, including the whole class, all 250 of them. After Judah's mother and sister are healed of their leprosy by Jesus Christ on the Mount of Olives. Jesus was here depicted by a brilliant phosphorescent light. This solution to the general's insistence that the Son of God not be depicted by a mere mortal is what finally persuaded Wallace to allow the Broadway impresarios Mark Claw and Abraham Erlinger to bring his novel to the stage. Look at that face. Like he can eat you up, and he did. And what did the fans of Ben-Hur see and hear on the stage? Well, much of what they heard was very familiar. Young retained enough of the language of the novel to convey a sense of familiarity and hence security to the audience, some of whom may have noticed that Young's play was constructed somewhat like a traditional Protestant worship service. It began with the invocation, the wise men and their star, and concluded with a benediction, the mighty hallelujah, of course, which I just showed you. In between, the play developed like a sermon, one that preached the gospel of family devotion and the love of God. And according to the Claw and Erlinger publicists, the play's sermon was more effective than those preached by many Christian ministers every Sunday. A few of you may have read an essay that I wrote on the stage play for a recent collection of essays on Wallace and Ben-Hur. I titled the article, In the Service of Christianity, Ben-Hur and the Redemption of the American Theater, 1899 to 1919. And in it showed, or attempted to, show how the stage play undercut the century-old Christian, especially Protestant, aversion to the theater as a place of temptation, immorality, illusion, and lies. Much as Wallace's novel during the previous 20 years had overcome a similar Christian objection to reading works of fiction. Those Claw and Erlinger publicists were central to the play's success in attracting first-time theatergoers, many of whom were rather conservative Protestants. The publicist emphasized that Young had saturated himself in Wallace's writing style and, under the spell of God, had produced a play that was filled with a religious exaltation seldom found even in a church. They reminded prospective customers that Wallace had himself been converted to Christianity in the process of writing Ben-Hur. They wrote articles telling first-time theatergoers how to reserve and pick up tickets, how to wait in line. They did not actually tell first-timers how to behave in the theater, when to applaud, for instance. But they did write articles about what they called a distinctly Ben-Hur audience, and they started calling it that very early on, and told readers how that audience behaved. So that's how you're supposed to behave. That's how you're supposed to behave. This audience was composed primarily of first-timers, and they behaved differently from the traditional audience. They were quieter, even reverent, as if they were in church. Early on in the press releases, the publicists began to describe the way in which the Claw and Erlinger production of Ben-Hur turned theater into church, at least for one evening. Now, perhaps this should not surprise us, because the period between the publication of Ben-Hur and the conclusion of the play's touring days, 1880 to 1920, was the heyday of an amazing series of Protestant preachers and evangelists who, with their charismatic, often outrageous personalities and preaching innovations, frequently turned church into theater. And there is a new book out, like you can see it. It's called When Church Became Theater. I recommend it. In the antebellum period, let's talk about some of these people. They're wild. In the antebellum period, Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother, Henry Ward Beecher, became his age's most popular minister. Have you heard of Henry Ward Beecher?
Absolutely.
Who at one point both scandalized and challenged his huge congregation in Brooklyn by holding a mock slave auction in the thronged sanctuary. He also survived the most sensational sex scandal of the century. Shortly after the Civil War, Dwight Lyman Moody more or less invented modern revivalism in Chicago and preached to crowds of thousands in starkly simple and emotional language that electrified the city and finally the nation. And speaking of nation, one of Moody's contemporaries was Carrie Nation, a fiery female reformer and self-ordained minister, who for 20 years waged holy war against demon drink and the saloon. Her favorite weapon? The axe. In the next generation, while the Claw and Erlinger Ben-Hur toured the nation, the former professional baseball player Billy Sunday became the nation's best-known evangelist by preaching simple and emotional sermons that frequently saw the man charge around the platform as if it were a baseball diamond, with Sunday hitting a home run for Jesus and sliding into home safe. Finally, in the 1920s, the most sensational evangelist of them all, Amy Semple McPherson, California, made a career of pulling off all sorts of stunts in church in order to gain publicity for herself and her Foursquare Gospel Church. This included roaring into her tabernacle on a motorcycle dressed as a cop and ticketing the audience for speeding on the highway to hell. She also faked her own kidnapping and miraculous rescue. Church is theater? Why not? Then, theater is church. The two turned out to work together amazingly well in the late 19th and early 20th century. And in 1916, the two worlds came together when Billy Sunday went to see the Claw and Erlinger production of Ben-Hur, still touring in 1916 in New York City, nearly 20 years after it had opened. The evangelist was very moved by the stage play as sermon that he saw and wrote a long article about it in which he urged all who could to see the play if at all possible. With typical Sunday hyperbole, he said that he wished that 100 million Americans could see it. That's just about all of them. I don't think Billy knew that there were not that many people. Now, Billy Sunday was doing the kind of work that the Claw and Erlinger publicists did for 20 years to drum up business for Ben-Hur. And I'm going to talk about that. They continued to assure the public that no expense had been spared on the costumes and scenery. And indeed, most of the independent reviews of the play were complimentary, and many were simply awestruck by the final visual impact of the production. Doesn't all that look ancient to you? As in these ballet scenes from the long episodes set in the Grove of Daphne in Antioch, where Judah goes as a tourist and is tempted by his pagan delights. As for the two spectacular action moments in the production, the sea battle and the chariot race, most reviewers marveled at the ingenuity involved in bringing especially the race to the stage, even though by 1900 horses were being raced, locomotives crashed, and boats sunk on stages everywhere. This is actually nothing big deal. Here, for example, is the huge yacht that sinks in another Claw and Erlinger production, Brewster's Millions, that ran concurrently with Ben-Hur for a while. in the early part of that century. Very occasionally, a reviewer would look at the creaky mechanisms involved in both the sea battle and the chariot race and point out the deficiencies that are all too obvious to us today. For instance, in what may very well be an apocryphal anecdote, none other than Susan Wallace herself is said to have reacted to the climax of the race, in which a wheel of Masala's chariot simply falls off by saying, in effect, "That's it." Or maybe like Peggy Lee once asked, "Is that all there is?" And what of plot and character development? Would those familiar with Wallace's novel have recognized Young's versions of Luke's tale of the Christ and the playwright's depiction of the principal characters in that tale? The reviews did occasionally criticize the way in which Young subordinated both plot and character development to the extravagant spectacle that came to dominate and define the production. More than one review complained that in the Claw and Erlinger Ben-Hur, the characters simply became scenery that talked. Young clearly intended to remain faithful to the very familiar novel, and he visited General Wallace at his home in Crawfordsville at least once. Wallace appears to have been satisfied with the stage play that the dramatist produced. Young stuck very close to the basic plot of the novel, with one exception. In the novel, Balthazar, the head wise man, and Simonides, the steward of the house of Hur, Balthazar, Simonides, and Judah Ben-Hur himself engaged in seemingly interminable debates about the nature of Jesus. You slug your way through 500 pages of Ben-Hur, thinking all was through, and then here comes Jesus, and they talk forever about, who is that man? What is he doing? Is he to be an earthly ruler and restore Israel to its Solomonic glory? Thus said Simonides. Or is he to be a savior of souls whose kingdom is not of this world? So spake Balthazar. Absolutely none of this endless debate is in the play. Thank God. Jesus is simply accepted by all as the miracle-working Son of God. End of story. In the play, the mystery is not about the true nature of Jesus, but about the real identity of the young Jew who returns to Antioch, obviously a Jew, but he's the adopted son of Quintus Arrius, the Roman tribune. In other words, the question wasn't who is Jesus, but who is Judah Ben-Hur? And they just talked about it for days. Young did make changes, some minor but some significant, in Wallace's principal characters. Now, as an example of the kinds of character changes that can be made in an adaptation, and that we will be following for the rest of this year and next year, I want to mention only Young's treatment of Simonides the steward and the two Egyptian females in the novel, the elderly nurse Amra and the wily temptress Eros, daughter of Balthazar, who, as I've said, was sort of the head wise man. Now, readers of the novel, and I'm playing like all of you are those. I know you're not. Readers of the novels knew that Simonides was defined by his Jewish faith, his love of his family, and his allegiance to the house of Hur and to his responsibilities for its protection. The Romans, seeking unsuccessfully for the Hur fortune, after Judah is sent away to prison and the galleys, cruelly tortured the steward, which left him dependent upon his loving daughter Esther, his aide and confidant Malu, and his household servants. Those servants, far and wide, did Simonides' bidding, which eventually produced a stunning fortune, the largest in the empire. The reader of the novel knew Amra as a simple and loving being who lived only for Judah, the boy who she had nursed from birth, and for Judah's family. But Wallace's Amra was a central actor in the novel. It was she who discovered that the mother and sister of Judah were lepers and then found them among the lepers and faithfully fed them for a while. Then, when she learned of Jesus' ability to cure leprosy, she took the women to the Nazarene to be healed. She touched them. She gathered them up. Amra risked her own life by, in her own thinking, by touching the leprous Hur women, and it was she and she alone who made possible the miraculous healing. Wallace, in other words, gave his little enslaved Egyptian woman crucial agency in Ben-Hur. For my money, the other Egyptian female character, Iris, is perhaps the only fully developed and therefore the most interesting character in Wallace's novel. A beautiful, witty, educated, cunning, and boundlessly ambitious temptress, this daughter of Egypt calls to mind her countrywoman, Cleopatra, and is, I suspect, Lew Wallace's take on the new woman of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. On two occasions in the novel, Iris beguiles Judah with Egyptian tales. One of them, How the Beautiful Came to the Earth, illustrates Wallace's complicated views about sex roles in general and strong women in particular. In her story, Iris tells Judah how the co-equal goddess Isis and the god Osiris together created man and woman. In effect, she provides in her story an alternative to the Judeo-Christian creation myth that undergird the late Victorian ideology of appropriate sex roles, an ideology of separate spheres of influence for dominant males and subordinate females, please. Now, as you all know, Lew Wallace had himself been raised by a very strong woman, his stepmother Zerelda, and then married an equally confident and competent female, Susan Elston. I have always sensed that the general was fascinated by his creation, Iris, but he didn't know what to make of her or to do with the proud Egyptian. From the moment that Judah saves Iris and Balthazar from the out-of-control chariot and four of Messala, the two men compete for the heart of the Egyptian. But Iris ultimately abandons both Judah and her father to join forces with Messala after Judah defeats the Roman in the chariot race, which in the novel at least, Messala survives, but as an impoverished cripple. In the epilogue of the novel, a much diminished but still proud Iris appears at the home of Judah and Esther in Naples to see their children and to tell Judah that, in the end, she had indeed been punished for casting her lot with the evil Messala, whom she finally murdered. Spoiler alert. At the end of Ben-Hur, Iris leaves the home of the Hurs, head held high, destitute and defeated, but still in control of her own destiny. The narrator suggests that, could the deep water of the Bay of Naples but speak, it would tell us of the fate of the proud daughter of Balthazar. What then does William Young do with Simonides and the two Egyptian females in the play? Well, for one thing, it is kind of disconcerting. He has the two characters talk to and interact with each other much more frequently than they do in the novel. He has them talking to each other all the time. It doesn't happen in the novel very much. Moreover, Simonides is much more central to the stage play than he is to Wallace's novel. In the play, it is Simonides, not Amra, who discovers through his spies that the Hur women are now lepers and have been released from prison. The final sense that one has of young Simonides is that despite his body being crushed by the Romans, the crippled man wields great power. He sits in a huge chair that looks like a throne, and throughout the play, Simonides the Jew makes things happen. Much more so than Judah, by the way. Simonides is also much more Jewish in the play than he is in the novel. The steward of the house of Hur is referred to by many as the Midas of Antioch, who has a preternatural ability to turn all he touches into money. Young describes the Jew in the language of Western Christian anti-Semitism. There is much discussion in the novel of making and protecting money and of the things of this world that money can purchase. Of necessity, the action of the play is also much more accelerated than in the novel. Everything happens at once after the race, as the lepers and Jesus become the focus of attention, leading up to their beating and the resulting miraculous cure of the women. But it is Simonides who makes all of that happen. Working through others, the steward of the house of Hur seems to move the world at his pleasure. And what of little Amra? In the play, Amra retains some of the agency that Wallace gave her in the novel. She still assists the Hur women and gets them to Jesus, But her movements in the play, like so much of the drama's action, are directed by an almost ever-present and omniscient Simonides. In the novel, Amr speaks eloquently of the powers of Jesus and urges Judah's sister and mother to make haste to follow her to the Nazarene. But in the play, Amr is too timid and retiring to speak for herself. Instead, she says to who else? Simonides, "Do thou speak for me." And finally, what of William Young's portrayal of Eros? In the play, the novel's fully developed, nuanced, and multifaceted Egyptian becomes a monochromatic caricature of female cunning and deceit, boundless ambition, and finally, pure, unadulterated evil. Gone are the extended vignettes and conversations that in the novel establish Eros as an intelligent, strong, funny, and in some ways at least, sympathetic woman. The change can be seen, for instance, in the stage cues for the Egyptian speeches. We are told that Eros is to speak half mockingly and most oftenly disdainfully and defiantly. There is no epilogue in the play, as there is in the novel, so Eros must be condemned and punished for her sins in the body of the drama itself, and punished she must be. To that end, she is roundly criticized by one and all. Young's Judah and Simonides become censorious and carping judges who repeatedly condemn Eros for her perfidy in several exchanges that simply do not occur in the novel. The most powerful of those invented scenes occurs before the chariot race, when Esther and Eros are awaiting Judah's arrival. Can you see here that Esther is veiled? Not Eros. And look over here. All the men gossiping, criticizing. When Judah does appear, the young man harshly criticizes Eros for appearing in public unveiled. The exchange of words between the two becomes quite heated indeed. And even the timid Esther gets into the act at one point. After Judah and Simonides have thoroughly chastised and berated the defeated Egyptian, Esther approaches the now cowering Eros and spits out, "O thou vile woman," vile woman, before she follows her father and master stalking from the stage. The contrast to the proud and self-possessed Eros of the novel's epilogue could not be more complete. In all of these ways, then, Young diminished female agency in the play, even as he increased the power of one of the general's male characters. Thus we see that William Young, although he dared not make substantial changes in the novel's basic plot, did make changes both major and minor in the characters in Ben-Hur and in their interactions with each other. Now, did the readers of the novel notice and, like the Munchkin fans of Harry Potter, complain about those changes? Well, if they did, I have not found any of their complaints in any of the hundreds of reviews I have read. Now, I have argued in print that if Uncle Tom's Cabin helped tear the nation apart over slavery, Ben-Hur helped stitch the Union back together again. This is an underappreciated impact that the novel and its legacy has had on the nation's history. By the time Wallace's novel was published in 1880, the nation had turned its back on the recently freed people of the South, and white Americans in both sections had acquiesced in the systematic repression of African Americans and the assertion of white supremacy in both North and South. This unhappy development continued for at least 50 years after the publication of the novel, well into the 1930s. And folks, we are living today through the first culture-wide debate over the Confederate statues and monuments that were erected North and South during that half-century. Without intending to do so, of course, Lew Wallace's tale of the Christ played a part in that sordid chapter of American history. How so? At some basic level, Ben-Hur is about slavery. But the slavery that entrapped Judah Ben-Hur was not based primarily on race, but was instead a condition into which anyone could fall for any number of reasons. He's an aristocrat. Judah, for instance, is enslaved as punishment for alleged criminal acts. Reading Judah's story, then, allowed Americans to think about the morality of slavery, which figures prominently in the novel, without the pesky distraction of the crucial factor of race prejudice. Moreover, Judah was a very peculiar slave, one who was free, was enslaved, but upon becoming freed, became a master himself. And Judah was as good a slave as he was a master. For example, while a slave, he asked the hortator on Quintus Arrius' galley to rotate him from side to side so that he would not become misshaped and hence less valuable in battle, protecting the owner's investment. And Judah was a very reluctant and uncomfortable master when he gained slaves. Judah accepted Simonides and Esther as his slaves only because under Jewish law, Simonides had agreed to become a slave for life and could not be freed by anyone, even the best of masters. He could marry a woman who was herself a slave for life. And besides, the faithful servant simply wanted to resume his accustomed role as the trusted steward of the house of Hur. Thus we see in Judah both a good slave and a good master. The abolitionists had argued that neither type existed. Wallace, however, blended the two together in the same very attractive white man. Reading Uncle Tom's Cabin made Northerners and Southerners think the worst about each other, laying the foundation for the emergence of opposing Yanks and Rebs that killed each other by the hundreds of thousands in the Civil War. The experience of reading Stowe's novel, then, was an intentionally inflammatory one. But 30 years after the publication of Stowe's controversial novel, everyone in late Victorian America, north, south, east, west, everyone loved Lew Wallace's Ben-Hur. And they could find satisfaction wherever they lived in following the trials and tribulations of this aristocrat who became a slave, was freed, and then became yet again not only a fabulously wealthy man, but a reluctant and generous master. Claw and Erlinger's staged version of Ben-Hur then took that beloved tale to the most remote corners of the reunited nation. The play pulled the Republic back together again, and it did it by taking itself through the ever-growing railroad system that slowly, in the last decades of the 19th century, had begun physically to bind up the nation's rules. The great American transcontinental railroads were the product of a succession of technological innovations and the adoption of standardized time zones. You thought about it? That's what made touring possible. Got it? Here is a map showing the extent of the rail system in 1870. How many transcontinental railroads do we have?
One.
That probably stops in Abilene, doesn't it?
West Kansas.
Here we go. And here is a map showing the enormously enlarged transcontinental stretch of that system by 1900, 2 years before the stage Ben-Hur took to the rails. The railroads in turn made possible the emergence of two distinctly American forms of national entertainment: the railroad circus that traveled the railroads, and the touring Broadway show. The stage Ben-Hur, it turned out, was both. It was even called, very often, the Sacred Circus. Perfect. The stage version of Ben-Hur opened to rapturous reviews on Broadway in November of 1899. It's played to sold-out audiences first in New York City and then in Philadelphia and Boston. Boston fans here tonight, but that's the only time I'm mentioning it. And then in 1902 began to tour, first nationally and then internationally until 1990. There had simply never been anything remotely like it, and never has been. No Broadway show has ever toured for 20 years. Not even Cats. It finally made its way to. I just love checking it. I took my schedule and I went figured out. It went to every state in the union except, you guess, South Dakota, Wyoming, Arizona, New Mexico. And from cities as small as Joplin, Missouri, to great metropolises like Chicago, it played in just about every American city that had an auditorium large enough to accommodate the enormous show. Sacred circus, like the railroad circus, traveled in special trains of at least 9 cars, sometimes 11 or 12, large enough to carry dozens of horses, a few camels, a cast of at least 200, and tons of costumes, scenery, and stage equipment. Especially in what became known as the Ben-Hur belt of Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. The show came to towns regularly and repeatedly, and attending the show became something of a family tradition, especially in the Ohio River family. I cannot tell you how many times Ben-Hur played in Terre Haute. Terre Haute every year. And those families attended the stage performances with the other families. Here comes an important statement. Here it comes. No, this is God's will. This is God with His providence. I need a great book.
Sacred Circus.
Or CSX, as the case may be.
Important statement. Something occurred to me. Americans had by definition, reading is a solitary act. Unless you have a sweetheart that you do things to. At most it's one or two. Or kids, right? Reading the book is a solitary act. Folks, going to the theater is a social act. A communal act. The stage play made Ben-Hur a communal social activity for the first time. On a large scale. The difference is crucial in understanding the powerful impact that the play had on American culture, and that impact went beyond America. In 1902, the show sailed to England and played for several years at London's Drury Lane. I expected more from Drury Lane. Kind of ditzy. Where the King and Queen of England loved the show and saw it from an especially constructed royal box. Edward VI, Bertie, loved Ben-Hur. In 1912, the production went to Australia and New Zealand, where it was very well received until on Palm Sunday, 1912, the Melbourne Theatre, where the show was playing, burned, destroying the colossal production and ending what had been a triumphal tour. The newspapers made much of the fact that a show that ended with the miraculous healing of the lepers and the subsequent Hallelujah chorus on the first Palm Sunday was destroyed by fire on Palm Sunday. They just talked about it for days. And like the railroad circus, the arrival of Ben-Hur for a few days in the town was a very big deal. Is anyone old enough to remember the day that the circus came to town? Are you serious? You're lying to me. Okay. The army of Claw and Erlinger publicists worked mightily to drum up daily audiences. The town's PR and marketing division was directed by Edward Toll, the business manager, and especially by Charles Cook, the show's advanced man. By 1900, the division had become very skilled in practice at its job and was particularly effective at using the local press. Months before the play was scheduled to open, the publicists flooded the local newspapers. About 6, 7, 8 years ago now, maybe more than that, I did a long research trip on the Ben-Hur Belt. I went to St. Louis, I went to Hot Springs in Little Rock, Arkansas, I went to Illinois, to Springfield, and to Indy, and read newspapers. Well, I thought I knew exactly when Ben-Hur came, and so I would start reading a week before and whatever. No, the publicists had articles published in the papers 3 months before. I had to change my whole plan because they were just flooded with it. And this is actually how Dr. Miller began to understand this was a big deal. You couldn't get away from the thing. They flooded the newspapers with articles about General Wallace and his mighty novel. They called it that all the time. The size and magnificence of the especially human interest about the play's stars, especially if those stars, any of them had a local connection, which turned out to be all the time, actually. And, as Larry knows, the publicists love to focus on the animals that travel with the show. Did you notice that Larry's essay on the wall ends with the problem or trouble with camels?
Sure. The problem with camels.
They loved them. They had endless stories. Larry, they had endless stories about the travails of those poor animals. Animals that proved to be very vulnerable to many diseases in the United States, and more especially to its often severe winters. And as the production aged over the years, they wrote features about one horse in particular, because it turned out that this horse was the only member of the show's 1899 cast that survived the entire 2 decades of its amazing run. I never got so tired of reading about a horse. Toll and Cook arrived, then Toll and Cook, this is going on for months, then Toll and Cook arrived a couple of weeks before the show was to open to supervise the installation of the huge production and to focus the community's attention on the project. Because of the complicated mechanism for the chariot race, the stages of virtually all of the theaters that hosted Ben-Hur had to be remodeled or modified in some way. Claw and Erlinger's company spent upwards of $1 million early 20th century dollars modernizing scores of theaters around the country during the 20-year run of Ben-Hur. Don't worry too much about it because Ben-Hur made so much money that Claw and Erlinger wound up controlling the entire American theatrical system. Got so bad that they had to fight for control of it with the Schubert brothers, and the Schubert brothers won. Ben-Hur made that fight possible. So for days, the community saw, sometimes they were bewildered, what are all those people doing of the theater? The community saw hordes of workers transforming the local theater. Then, Cook, who was particularly good at appealing to the local pride of each community, and was very good about boosterism. When it was all done, he assured the locals in extended newspaper interviews after the work of the theater was finished that their town or city now had the largest, most up-to-date and impressive stage in the state, region, or nation, depending on what he thought he could get by with. And then the Sacred Circus itself came to town, all 9 cars. As with the railroad circus, the arrival of a special train with multiple cars became the center of community's attention. Crowds gathered to watch the production, with its sets, costumes, and animals unload and processed to the theater, which was often filled to overflowing with the production. Then the publicists went into overdrive. They wrote rave reviews of the production, attributed themselves, and warned constantly that each performance was on the verge of selling out, which was sometimes true, most of the time it wasn't. The publicists also reported on special rail excursions that brought people to the production from nearby communities. This is where you came to realize just how dense, not only was it transcontinental, the railroad system was dense. You could go anywhere on the railroad. You know that, don't you? And they did. Railroads made tons of money off Ben-Hur and vice versa. And they almost always ran this front page extended article that told, as you read, how Ben-Hur won his race. Now, as you see, in this instance, the story appears, can you see down here? Ben-Hur Ride Racing Stables? It's an ad.
Oh.
It's an ad. The story appears in conjunction with an ad from the local Ben-Hur Racing Stables. And, indeed, local businesses that advertise special Ben-Hur sales to be held before and after the show stays. And in this one, I just love it. I just almost had a cat when this is from the Decatur, Illinois paper, and I took it to show the director of the archives. She died. She's kind of like Bette Midler. She's very funny. She just almost died when she saw this. Driving the team, that's Judith. Kate Fine, driving a team of furniture. Finally, the publicist even ran Ben-Hur cartoons. I'm fairly sure, kiddos, that this is the first. This is the first. And when I saw this, I just thought, there's a God. There's the cutest little groundhog on a stair around coming, not Ben-Hur. All right. And while the newspapers did all of this, the cast and crew settled into the community for the duration. Can't emphasize this enough. There was a couple to 300 of them, cast and crew. They usually stayed in boarding houses and circulated in the community. No hotel could hold that many people in Decatur, Illinois. And they were encouraged to meet the local citizenry. They did so by often challenging the locals to athletic competitions, especially baseball, which was sweeping the nation in the early 20th century. Because their tours were often in the northern states during the winter, the company frequently joined the locals in ice skating. I read constantly about skating with the cast and crew of Ben-Hur. They ate in local cafes and often worshipped in local churches, and very occasionally they wound up in the local jails and the local courts. It's important to remember that the stage Ben-Hur toured for 2 solid decades. Think back to 1997. Just let that sink in. Every year on the rails, repeatedly bringing the show to communities throughout the land. And remember, this is after the 2 previous decades in which the novel sold more copies than any book in the United States that wasn't the Bible. I like to think that this nearly half a century, as the crucial period in which Wallace's tale of the Christ was permanently embedded in the hard drive of American popular culture in an utterly unique way. It's never happened with another literary property. Never, not Uncle Tom's Cabin, not The Count of Monte Cristo, nothing. The impact of the novel, of course, was exclusively literary, textual. But the stage play continued and intensified the visual tradition of the tableau vivant and stereoscopic shows. As the adaptation process continued, pictures became more important than words. For nearly half a century then, the novel and its visual adaptations kept the general's tale of the Christ continually before the eyes of the American people. And in those decades, the next major development in popular culture was being discovered and perfected. And what was that next development? Pictures. But pictures that would move. In the 20 years that the Claw and Erlinger Ben-Hur toured the nation and the world, European technicians and artists primarily created the modern movie industry. I don't think it's too much to say that Lew Wallace's Ben-Hur became perhaps the most sought-after literary property for adaptation to film. For almost 20 years after Lew Wallace's death, his son, talk about redoubtable, Henry Lane Wallace rejected all offers to turn Ben-Hur into a motion picture, largely because he didn't think that it was good enough for Ben-Hur yet. That he kind of sensed that the art form had not matured yet. And as we will see next year, if I get invited back, after Henry finally agreed to the first cinematic adaptation in the early 1920s, the first moving picture version of Ben-Hur was first and foremost a visual spectacle. And it was silent. Not a word was spoken. Bear with me now as I conclude on a personal note, like you have any choice. I'm going to attempt to relate my childhood to the tradition of the touring Broadway show in which the stage Ben-Hur played such a crucial role. And you're going to learn more about Dr. Willer than you need to. I was raised in the 40s and 50s in the small town of Loving, Texas, population 300. 100 miles west of Fort Worth and about 30 miles south of Archer City, where Larry McMurtry's last picture show was filmed. Larry McMurtry is from Archer County, just one county above Pike County. We were raised about the same time. He's rich, I'm not. I was the only boy in a family of 6. Isn't that cute? Our father was a tenant farmer who taught himself to be a farmer. Do I need to say that we were poor? Now, every 2 years, 2 shows came to my little town. In the spring, the Loving Baptist Church, my church, here it is as it looks now, sponsored a week-long brush arbor revival. You ever heard of such a thing? That featured a traveling evangelist, which could be very entertaining when it was not frightening. Now talk about frightening. Oh, fooey. Well, this is real slide. Bear with me. Right over here, whoops, go back. Right about there, there's a little bit of a great arbor. The other way. What do you mean? It's not. No. It's no, the other way.
I think it's just cut
Oh,
off.
it's just, that's just fine. Because here's what it looks like now.
Wow.
Actually, in a good year back in 1946, it could look like that. Brush arbor. Then, that's one kind of show, and was entertaining. Those preacher boys could get pretty feisty. Then in the fall, the Haverstock, what do they call it here? The Haverstock Tent Show arrived in town. And in town, I mean Loving, 300. A traveling show came to town. 300 people. This is going to make me sound pathetic. They unloaded the equipment just like the Circus or just like Ben-Hur and erected a tent in the vacant lot next to C.F. Harmon's grocery store where my daddy was the butcher. Now, this is the tent erected in the town in Illinois, about the size of Loving, in 1946. This is not Loving. That's what you see at Harmon's grocery store. But there you can see, I'm not sure what you can see. That's not a good picture. This says Haverstock, and over here, a little you can't see, it's the Toby and Susie show. But this is about what the tent looked like when I first saw it as a little boy of 6 or so, 1946, 1947. And I just thought it was wonderful. For 5 wonderful nights, the troupe put on a show that I thought was miraculous. The leading man, Roland Haverstock, who was the son of the founder of the troupe, did his magic act which was to me at least magical. The company put on a different 3-act melodrama every evening that starred Roland and his wife Peggy. Then an older couple named Toby and Susie did their very funny vaudeville act. It's actually based on the Toby shows from England. You ever heard of those? Okay. The Toby jugs that come from that. And this man right here, this very man, really is the Toby I saw 70 years ago. The troupe stayed in Loving for a week. They shopped at CF's, came to church on Sunday, and spent each day rehearsing and drumming up business for the evening's performance. Folks, I thought that these wondrous people were gods. Come to my little town to show me that there was a great world out there that wasn't Loving, Texas. Actually, in a way, the journey that brought me to this place tonight started with that. I thought they were from heaven. What I didn't know is that in reality, they all lived in a little town not very far away in southern Oklahoma. I now know that the Haverstock Company was founded in Oklahoma in 1911, right in the middle of the 20-year touring history of the stage Ben-Hur. And hundreds of small companies like the Haverstock Troupe were formed in the first decade of the 20th century to bring to rural and small town America the kind of entertainment that the railroad circus and the touring Broadway show brought to the cities of the United States. The Haverstock Company finally closed in 1954, not many years after I sat enraptured in their tent in my little Texas town. Huge shows like the Claw and Erlinger's Sacred Circus brought diversion, excitement, and joy to urban America. But little troops, little shows, like the Haverstock Company's Toby and Susie show, ensured that kids like me in villages that sometimes had fewer than the cast of the stage Ben-Hur shared in that excitement and joy, and in my case at least, inspiration and hope. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Any questions?
So,
Mary, 1 hour.
very precise. Dr. Miller,
Yes.
could you describe the
Do people know who you are?
I'm Bill Gormley from Noblesville, Indiana, which is the latest stuff. The rest is history, as my wife will tell you.
Yes, sir.
Could you describe the mechanism that they used for the treadmill for the race? How did that, was it just a huge treadmill? And how fast did it move?
Oh, Lord, I don't really know the answer to that. Did you see the...
I saw the mechanism, the picture, yeah.
So what is it you want to know? There you can
Well,
go on too.
there's this probably apocryphal tale that in Boston one night on
If it was in
Boylston.
Boston, it's not apocryphal. It happened.
Well,
Tell them.
one night Masala won because of the chariot that Ben-Hur was in broke down or something. The treadmill
Well, there's a
broke.
little bit, but you know what it really was? His horses got tired of losing. Actually, the treadmill is actually quite simple, and there was a Broadway show called the County Fair, and that's where the shows began to have. But there were horse races all over Broadway, and their huge locomotives crashed. And Brewster's big, the Youngstown. But the horses actually won that one. There was some problems with it, but not enough. And everyone just said, "Oh, give it to them." Give it to them.
The treadmill mechanism actually was pretty sophisticated for Ben-Hur, which was one of the wrinkles. Treadmill was going this way through a gear system and had a cyclorama behind it. And so the faster the horses ran, the faster that would spin. But they went the extra steps, and Ben-Hur's chariot was actually on the treadmill, so it ran. Masala's was a little farther away from the audience. It was not on the treadmill. His wheels were run with electric motors that would facilitate the crash. But they also put pots of dust underneath, so the faster the horses could hit the treadmill, the more dust would fly up.
And the tapes would fly and stuff
And
like
they
that.
would rein the horses back when they got to the curve, so the cyclorama would slow down and then it would speed up again. And it was pretty jaw-dropping. It was dangerous. The horses were running at full gallop, and they would be released. Masalas would be released to fly off stage.
Wow.
And there was one point, the story about the Boston, William S. Hart was the Masala, and he wrote about it in his biography about the horses winning the race. But there was another instance where William S. Hart was a very good horseman. There was a point where the horses are brought out on stage before the race, and there was a man that was assigned to control the horses. And one night, something happened, and he was knocked down, and the horses started to bolt. And there were 200 people on the stage, and these horses panicked. And William S. Hart was able to get a cloak over their heads and hold them down until they calmed down, and then he sort of walked them off the stage. So it was electrifying. And people in those days understood horses more than we do now, and so they understood what these animals were doing on stage and how dangerous and exciting it was.
And also, thank you, Larry. Also, when these things happen, the Clara and Erlanger publicists really used them because it made other people want to come to see, is there going to be some sort of danger, that kind of stuff?
Just like
Puddle tonight?
That's right.
Absolutely, they're not crazy. Yes.
When they had to rebuild every stage.
No, not every stage.
But they installed this mechanism.
And
Did they then
it also
tear it apart
required
and take it with
building
them
a
again?
false stage also.
Did they tear it all down?
Yes.
And take it to the next place, or were
But
these?
it would also then be there, that the basic structural
basic
changes
structure.
would be there.
But
And
they
what they
take
really
the
did is just
treadmill with
model.
them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
And then the crew who simply just went 2 weeks ahead of the show and installed it. But what they did was that they almost always had to enlarge
Sure.
the stage
Sure.
and just sort of modernize.
And the
everything.
exits and the enters and
That is
entrances
exactly
and
right.
everything.
And,
Because
so,
they had horses.
and Claude Erlinger they had enormous productions. They had one called Mother Goose that was even larger than Ben-Hur.
Really?
Because they did all of the fairy stories.
Oh, flying. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, exactly.
Crazy.
So what they were doing was kind of transforming the stage for a kind of mega productions of the kind that we know today.
So the Phantom of the Opera is nothing compared to this stuff. No, nothing.
This is what the
Child's
kind of
play.
stuff that made
Yes.
that made that possible.
Yes.
Have you ever been in backstage of a huge Broadway or
Not a big one.
because and the auditorium in Chicago was the largest, and correct me Larry if I'm wrong. I think it was the largest one in the United States, and there's where they had 5 chariots finally.
20 horses racing.
Yeah, 20 horses.
Now, is that still?
Can you imagine the nose?
Yes, the auditorium's still
What,
there.
what is that?
It's called it was built by Burnham and Root, and it's called the Auditorium Building.
It's right there.
Where
Roosevelt
is that?
University.
In Chicago.
It's right downtown. It was one of the early buildings built after the fire.
It's a Richardson building.
Yeah.
Do they use it now for?
It's part of Roosevelt University now.
Oh, okay.
Very stunning interior, a lot of wrought iron, and
Yeah.
very elaborate.
Good organ. Yes, ma'am.
I have a question because of how long with all this remodeling and how long would the place stay in town?
The remodeling usually took about a week, and the runs ran from 3 days, probably just 4 actually. And someplace like the Chicago, the auditorium, they can stay as long as 10 days.
Okay, so they were just a short,
So that's not
just
very
a
long.
short time there for all the remodeling they did then.
Yes, but it just made. But then of course, but then Charlie Cook would come in and tell you just how extraordinary it all is, and it was all just promotion for one thing.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
okay.
I mean, Claude and Erdogan got their money worth out of it, yeah. But they had all these other productions that they wanted to bring to these towns. Because it's the 20s and 30s that is really the 20s anyhow. That's the heyday of the traveling Broadway shows. And Ben-Hur simply made that possible.
It was still very successful in 1919 when it was taken down. And from what I understand, it was because Henry Wallace was beginning negotiations for the
That's
movie.
exactly right.
Oh.
And
It also was beginning to get very difficult to commandeer enough railroad things because of the war. And truth to tell, by 1918, it was just beginning to looking a little bad.
A little, yeah.
It wasn't until
Little warm.
about 1914, 15